Greetings, everyone. My name is Peter Young. I'm a member of the Committee 100, and I happen to be chair of the Asian American Career Ceilings Program, which this particular event is part of. It's been wonderful. We've done 48 or 49 events and seminars and summits over the last 3 or 4 years, and covering all different types of topics. This one is very special because in the fall, we decided we'd start a series of master classes. And to distinguish it from the other ones we were doing, it's where we sort of do a tutorial, which is help individuals, give them the insights and tools to succeed. So, for example, the next master class of this series will be on May 6th, and it's on how to build your personal network, including through strategic alliances. And networking clearly is one of the more important things about how to succeed and to break through career ceilings, et cetera. So I welcome you to attend that session. So this is a very interesting session because if you think about the background, Asian Americans do really, really well in entry level and then all the way through the mid ranks. But for some reason, it gets to be very tough for them to get to the CEO ranks. And we're very, very pleased to have John Lee, who is the president and CEO of MKS Instruments. It may not be a household name for many of you, but those who are in his part of the industry, it's a household name. It's a public company. They have 3.6 billion in revenues, and they provide products and technologies used to measure, control, power, and monitor critical process parameters for advanced manufacturing processes. So it's a very high-tech, very important company in terms of how manufacturing operates in this country and around the world. The reason why I asked John to be interviewed here on this fireside chat was he has had an extraordinary career rising to the ranks at various companies, but he joined MKS Instruments in 2007. He had increasingly senior roles and then became CEO in 2020. Now, what's interesting is if you try to count the number of Asian Americans who are the CEOs of public companies where they did not start the company. So Jensen Huang doesn't count. He started NVIDIA. Eric is one who started Zoom. Those people, of course, they have been very successful. But if you start the company, it's a lot easier to become the CEO, right? So what's much harder, and the list is very short, of Asian Americans who have joined a company they did not start and became the CEO of a public company. And John is one of a very small number. So what I hope today is that we'll learn, one, some lessons from his own just career in general, but also some of his insights about what are some of the nuances if you're Asian American and you want to take the journey that he's taken and be as successful as John has been. So he'll make observations about his career, but he'll also share some of the parameters and maybe speculate a little bit about how things are changing today that might change and what are the tools to be successful rising through the ranks. So the last thing I want to say is we will have a Q&A session at the end, and it'll depend, how long will depend upon how many questions you ask. And the way you ask them is there's a Q&A chat box. Somebody's already put in a comment. Just starting from now, just type in your questions. And John and I will be able to see your questions, and we'll gauge how much time at the end, and then we'll go through your questions. So with that, John, maybe I'd like you to start and just talk about your career and your personal history, but also how you became CEO of MKS.
Well, great. Thanks, Peter. And thanks for having me. It's a privilege. I think the way I would start it is I started out more traditional from what you would expect from an Asian American. I was an engineer, and my father was an engineer, and we went through school up to a PhD level. And then my first job was as a research scientist. So kind of normal track for a stereotypical Asian. And somewhere along the way, I obviously thought I like people, I like organizations, I like having a bigger impact. And in order to do that, it probably wasn't in the realm of R&D. So slowly branched out into development and then the business, and then financially managing businesses. And so it was an evolution, but the starting point was actually quite typical of many Asian Americans, certainly in my generation. I would say that I was born in Taiwan, left when I was 5. My father came here for graduate school. As a result, I grew up in the United States during my formative years, and I grew up in Middle America, Pennsylvania, right? Kind of like the countryside,
Yeah,
Pennsylvania.
yeah.
Yeah, and so you were a minority for sure. There were a lot of Asians in Pennsylvania, and I would say also that maybe some of the things that formed maybe how I interact with people and feel comfortable in the American culture is that I ended up playing a lot of sports, team sports. And I do have some anecdotes about, CEOs and whether they play team sports or individual sports or any sports, um, or any leader, in fact. And I think being on a team does teach you certain things. And then being on a team where you're a minority teaches you additional things.
And what was your sport?
Well, I played everything I could. So I played baseball, Taiwan, Little League, you got to do that.
Yeah.
Uh, Basketball, soccer. So uh,
So traditional sports and
very
traditional.
traditional. Yeah. A funny story. I did want to play football,
Yeah.
American football, not soccer. My dad said, I'm not letting you run your head into other people's heads. And it's probably not going to end well for your future career, making a living using your head, hopefully. Um, but all were team sports. All were great experiences of how to lead teams, how to be part of a team, the dynamics of teams. And I think that certainly became quite useful as I moved up into managing human beings, because it is all about teamwork here. So yes, traditional, technical track, and then moved on to the business over time.
And did you get criticized by your father when you left the holy PhD engineering world?
Maybe like many Asian parents, once you get past the school, they're done. They're kind of done. You made it. You got to the MIT or whatever, and his work is done. And after that, it should all be good. And by that time, of course, he's retired, and you're adults and you can make your own decisions. But he was certainly very proud of the fact that his kids went to schools that were well regarded and did technical education, technical degrees first.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because we're not too different in terms of generation. And I was raised by a traditional Asian family, and they said, well, there's only one school we want you to go to, MIT. And you have a choice. You could be a doctor or you could be a scientist. And they were very much against team sports and all these other things. So my sister and we revolted. I secretly went into varsity sports, and I secretly ran for student body treasurer or whatever. And they finally figured out, and they were very upset, right?
Mm.
And they were also very upset because I got into MIT, but I didn't go, which was the absolute biggest crime, right?
Sacrilege,
Get
right?
in and not go was the
Yeah.
biggest crime. But in retrospect, they finally said, you know something? Being one of those varsity sports and actually did make you a better person, so, I agree with you about the sports and so forth. I just I broke ranks a little bit earlier than you, right? In terms of schooling, I didn't get the PhD. So tell me though, um, you, you know, you joined MKS and so forth. As you rose through the ranks, did you feel at all that people were conscious of the fact that you were Asian American, and did it influence in any way how they behaved towards you, when you worked with them?
Yeah, I think not at MKS actually, and that's one of the reasons I stayed actually.
Yeah,
So I have worked at other companies where you might get a little bit of that feeling, but I think most corporations, certainly corporations that do, business that do a lot of technical work, have a lot of Asians in the company. So
yeah.
it's not like you're standing out, at all. And so I think you don't feel like you're not part of the team. I think society might be different if you're living in a place where, it's, you're a minority. So no, but I would say this, certain companies have that culture and certain companies don't.
Yeah.
Um, and I was fortunate to join MKS, which was, a company that, previous to me were run by, male CEOs, white, but they were all Italian. So people thought you had to be an Italian to become CEO here. And I told them my last name ends in a vowel, just not preceded by a consonant. But I'm halfway there. But I found the culture much more about capability and could you do the job. Um, and I think it's because the people who led the company back then came from humble beginnings. Every one of them came from pretty humble beginnings. So they didn't come from a privileged background. They earned everything they made. They made it to the levels they made through their own capability and hard work. And I think they appreciated that most of anybody. And so they didn't really see me as, oh, you look different. They saw me as, are you humble? Can you do the work? And do you share the same values that we do? And if you did, then you have a chance of potentially leading the company.
It's very interesting that you point that out because, with a lot of people, they give advice, etc. But, very few people say, choose wisely, and in fact, and maybe you weren't conscious, it wasn't conscious to you that MKS was a kind of place that didn't necessarily discriminate on race. But the reality is, and those of you in the audience, think about it. Uh, all these different companies are different. And you can choose to say, go into a company where there's a lot of discrimination, so forth, and decide to be a pioneer and be successful. And that's a possibility. But also, you want to consider when you make a job decision, right? When you come out of school or whatever, one of the things you want to check out is what their philosophy is about people, gender, and race. And you make a personal decision. It doesn't mean that you should go to this, the company where race is the least issue, right? It may not be successful, it may not have good technology, a lot of different things that would drive your decision on where you. But were you actually conscious of that, or was sort of an unconscious sense, John, that you had when you talked to them about joining?
Yeah, I think the thing I was conscious about was whether the culture of the company was very political or not. Not
Yeah,
whether it was, a racist company or whatnot. I think I wanted to come to a company from the other companies I've been at where it felt like to get ahead, you had to be political.
yeah,
Yeah, better at it than most. And I'm not. I'm just not very good at it. And I also think it's a waste of energy and time and resources because, half the people are protecting themselves from the other half of the people instead of competing against the competition. So that was one of the most important things I looked for in whichever company I was going to go to. And I found it at MKS. And even today, as the leader of MKS, I work extremely hard to minimize that. It's always there. People are people, right?
yeah.
But you can minimize it. And from that, what happens is you get this virtuous circle. You attract people who like it, who want to be in an environment where it's not political, because they're not. And suddenly that becomes the cultural norm, right? But you gotta be attentive. You have to make sure that every time you have a new member of the team come, it's a new team. The whole team is new because one new person is, a new
Changes the whole
dynamic,
environment, right?
right? And you've got to make sure that the culture you've worked so hard building is protected.
Yeah, and I think a point that many people observe is by it is absolutely true that the bigger the company, the more politics there are, right? Now it's you can have politics in a company with three people, right? So it's not a given, but there's no question that there's a tendency to have more politics, et cetera, in larger companies, which comes back to your point, which is it gets harder to pick places where there's less politics as they get bigger, right?
That is true. That is true. So you have to really find, a company that really believes in that and really works hard to do that. And when I joined MKS, it was smaller. So, it was 2,000 people, 700 million. Now it's 10,000 people and, 3.5 billion. And now, though, we tried to make sure that even though we're 10,000 people, everybody feels included, like you're part of something, you're welcomed here, right? And certainly that's something we work hard at, and I think we probably do better than most, I'd say.
Yeah. If you were to pick the three or four things, you know, you're going up the elevator and somebody turns to you and say, I'm getting off in, four floors. What are the three or four things that were key to yours getting ultimately to the CEO?
Yeah, I think the first and foremost is competence.
Yeah,
You have to actually be able to do the job. Um, and I think a lot of Asian Americans who, worked hard and studied hard, that's usually not the problem. That's table stakes, right? Because of just the way we get brought up. But you still have to be able to do that job. I think the tough thing is when you are competent at a technical skill, that's a different competence than competence and a managerial skill.
that's true. Absolutely.
Right? You're now managing human beings. That's not it's not atoms and moving light beams around. It's human beings. They're squishy. It's a whole new different skill set. So I think one of the things that I was always interested in is the human story behind the person. So I was curious, like what was the background of this person? Everybody has a huge life that they had and lots of experiences they had. I was always curious, like to find out what made them tick and their experiences. So if you don't have that curiosity, it's really hard to kind of move up into management and manage people because you kind of have to like people, at least be interested in
Yeah.
people because you're going to be managing them, you're going to be motivating them, you're going to be leading them, right? And those are just very different skill sets. And I think a lot of Asians, if you will, find that transition hard. And it's not just Asians, anybody who's technical trying to move into managerial positions. It is a difficult transition. That's why we have technical ladders. That's why companies have technical ladders, right? So you're great technically, we'll promote you. We don't want you managing people. Other people, you're great at leading and managing people. And so that was the second thing is to be able to have that interest in managing people, you have to learn a whole new different skill set. I think as you get even higher, you're now managing financial performance. And I didn't get an MBA. I think you did, and many people do, and many CEOs have MBAs.
Although I'm not, if you ask me today, what do I think I actually learned in the 2 years of business school? I'm not 100% sure.
Right, maybe, but I'm sure you learn a lot. But I think the point is to get to that CEO level or even a general manager level, something a little lower, they are now paying you and rewarding you for managing the P&L, the profit and loss, the profitability, and the financial success of that enterprise, that division, that company. And so there's a whole nother set of skills
Yeah.
that I had to learn through trial and error and made mistakes and whatnot. Uh, and didn't go to business school, but had that curiosity too. I really want to understand that, even when I didn't have a true P&L. So stages in my career, the three were, technical capability, and then human being management capability, and then financial management capability. Those are the three transitions that I went through.
Is there, every company is different, right? Even in the same industry, they're different. I was at Salomon Brothers and I was at Lehman Brothers, really different, or very large, very political, but they're very different. Uh, the saying was, if your enemies at Salomon Brothers would run at you and stab you from the front, your enemies at Lehman Brothers run up and stab you from the back. That was the difference, right? But
Right.
if you think about MKS, which is it's not a wildly different company. It wasn't, it's not, like Ben and Jerry ice cream, which is a very special ethic. What do you think was different about MKS and things that you had to maybe adapt to in order to be successful versus
Yeah.
other companies you're aware of?
Yeah, I would say this. NKS started as a small company, right, and privately owned. And so it developed this culture of frugality. Everything was treated as if it was your own money.
Yeah.
Would you do this if it was
Yeah.
your own money? A lot of companies say that, but at MCAS versus the other companies I work for, I felt like, wow, people are really, really conscious about being responsible about the money they spend. And that's a culture and a value that we try to propagate, even though we've acquired many companies throughout our history. And the reason I think is the reason why we're so frugal is because we are in an industry that's very cyclical.
Right.
So the semiconductor equipment industry, our original market, is quite cyclical. It can go up 30% in 2 quarters, like 2 quarters. It's up 30%. It go down 30% in two
Wow.
quarters. And in the semiconductor equipment industry, this happens every 2 or 3 years. And that's been true for 70 years. So it's not stopping, right? And when you are going up 30%, it's about running around trying to ship everything. When you go down 30%, it's about putting the brakes on,
Yeah.
watching your cost, because during a downturn that could last a year or 2 or 3, you have to be able to sustain R&D during a downturn because your customers are kind of counting on you to do that R&D. And if you can't, then you don't get the design win. So when the upturn comes, you're smaller, you're less successful. And the companies that are left, including MKS, uh, after 70 years, are the ones who have been able to manage the financial performance of the company in a really scalable and frugal way. And that's part of the culture that we try to imbue in all of the associates that we have.
You know, in the audience here, you know, they're here to get some lessons and do's and don'ts. What are some of the don'ts that you would get advise the attendees? I'll give you one example. It's not a don't. It's a do it with your eyes open. And that is, there are a lot of people say, okay, I'm going to succeed as an Asian and I'm going to join Lehman Brothers Asia or, you know, whatever it is, so forth. The good news is maybe you have a special language or cultural
Mhm.
advantages and so forth from doing that. The bad news is you may get stuck and stereotyped and never get back to the corporate headquarters. This happens to many people I know. But what are the don'ts that you want to highlight that you've learned from your experience and the experience of other Asian Americans that you know?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things is to be, involved into that company's culture and the people in it. I think that you want to lean in, you want to be part of that company, you want to engage with people, you want to build that network within the company. You know, all of us are on the spectrum of introvert and extrovert, and I shade more towards introvert. I know that taking tests. I'm not a total introvert, but I'd be fine by myself, right? And so for me,
You
for an
just don't
introvert,
appear to be an introvert, by the way, John.
well, I think for an introvert, it's work. It's hard. It's not like you can't learn to be somebody who speaks in public, somebody who speaks in front of crowds. But for me, it's stressful. It's work. Whereas an extrovert gets energy out of it. And so if you're shading more towards introvert, or maybe you grew up where, your parents say, don't talk unless you're spoken to, because, we're the elders and you're not. I think you have to really be conscious of, you have to reach out. It's not your natural tendency. And when you think about, if you want to be a leader, you know, people gotta know you, right? And they gotta know that you want to be part of the team, to lead the team. If you're always in your office or you don't go out and socialize, right, with the rest of the team, you don't have to be, totally overboard. But if you don't participate in those things, then people are like, well, he's not here, right? Maybe he doesn't care. Who knows, right? They make up stories about why you're not there. And and it is a sacrifice, right? You're giving up family time, you're giving up other things. So I think one of the things is to make sure, whatever the culture of the company is, if it's a golfing culture, take up golf. If it's drinks at night on Friday, be there with everybody else, right? I think that's an important part of showing everybody
Yeah,
that you want to be part of this team and at some point lead that team.
yeah, that's right. Um, but and it's interesting though what you said, and you know this thing about networking is also comes up all the time. I would say 50% of these webcasts that we have, someone talks about networking and its importance. And that in fact that's a flaw of Asian Americans, not all Asian Americans, but many Asian Americans, that they don't know how to network, and they reverse also, they don't actually reach down and help people below them, to network and so forth. How important was networking to you in your career? And if it was, you know, what were the kinds of things you did to try to create kind of thoughtful, constructive networking?
Yeah, I think the way I've approached networking is, you're going to meet people throughout your career that you like, and that you find, that you share a lot in common. And you have to work at keeping those relationships, even when you both separate and go to some different organization. And I've always taken the view that, we're probably all going to be in a similar industry, or you might be in a function where it could go across any industry. And I might need to call on you someday and say, hey, would you want to come over here because we've got an opportunity? I've seen that happen quite often. And my network has always been multicultural, just whoever it is, in every race, every gender, everything. Because I don't think you want to narrow yourself, right, just to, Asian Americans. That's just too narrow. You can certainly work on that, but I would always be open to all, everybody who wants to build that network. And the best networkers are people like that. And as a result, they're also the ones that give you opportunities. So they'll maybe give you a board seat. Maybe they'll say, hey, there's an opportunity over here. Um, I
And,
think
and people return the favor.
that they return the
Decent people
favor.
will find a way to return the favor, right?
Right,
Yeah.
right. And some people will drop everything and say, John asked me to go over here. I know I work well with him. I know you'll never lead me astray. I'm going, right? And it's a mutual win because I know that person, what they can do, and that's really going to be helpful. I do spend a lot of time on mentoring as well. That's one of my passions. I think that if you reach down to folks and try to bring them up, I look at it as at some point, someone helped me, right? I had many
Yeah, yeah,
mentors. And so I think that's really something that, it's kind of a responsibility, but it's also good for, even your own career, because you never know, someone who's only 10 years younger, you might be mentoring 20 years ago, suddenly, they're the CEO of something else, right? You never know where people will go. So I think reaching down also gives you a lot of personal satisfaction. And it also motivates the team to feel like, John's not all about himself. I think that's one of the attributes, I think, of leadership, which is not just humble, but I do believe in the servant leader idea. You're here to help the organization and the people in the organization move forward. If you really don't believe that, you can't fake it.
yeah.
People can
That's right.
smell that a mile away, right? And so if you're not going to be that way and you can't be that way, then you're going to have a harder time leading people. You're going to have a harder time getting people to follow you, right?
Yeah,
And I think when I'm looking down on who to promote, one of my biggest attribute or criteria is, who do they have under them?
yeah, yeah,
Right? Are they attracting really talented people and nurturing them? Or are they the best and only person that can do everything, and everybody underneath can't possibly do what they do? It's an attribute that we would say, no, we don't need that. We will want to promote someone who's going to build the team under them, because we're asking them to take on a bigger role to build a bigger team under them, right?
yeah. So unless you're a one-man band running a lemonade stand, you got to work with people, right?
Yeah.
It's interesting also. I think I do an enormous amount of mentoring for many, many years, right? I I I I mentor individuals, but I also mentor small companies, right?
Yeah.
And what I found, what's interesting, which I didn't realize until I mentored for a while, was I learned some stuff from it. Because when you're giving somebody advice, it makes you reflect on yourself. And I've realized some things about myself that I would never have figured out uh, if I hadn't, had tried to help someone. you know?
Yeah, absolutely sure. Totally agree. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Of course, my wife says I have a long way to go, but uh,
We all do. Yeah.
no, but by the way, I'll tell you one simple story. You were talking about politics. I have a direct example. So this Asian American kid was got a mid-30s, asked if I could give him some advice. And he came in and he says, I'm in investment banking. I work for three major investment banks. I figured Bay of A, Morgan Stanley. He was on to his third large investment bank. And I think I'm leaving it to go to a different industry. So I said, well, let me ask you some questions. So I asked questions. And I said, do you love the work you do every day? He said, I love it. I love the work I do. I said, so what is it you're not happy about? Oh, the politics and so forth. I said, your problem is not investment banking. You
Mm.
love investment banking. Your problem is you've been working for three large investment banks where there are lots of politics. So, like you were saying, go find a less political investment bank or a smaller one. And he left. He said, unbelievable. He says, I came in here asking you, where does one go if you leave investment banking? I left saying I should stay in investment banking but just find a less political, smaller firm.
Yeah.
And he's a happy guy now. So, but it actually made me reflect on why I left Lehman Brothers to start
Mm.
my own firm. And
Right.
I now realize it's because I'm like you. I don't like politics, right? I can deal with politics, but I don't like politics, right? And you got to love politics in certain situations, right?
Yeah. Right.
One thing that we've learned over time, we had some experts and leading researchers at Columbia and MIT, so forth, do studies and they say, well, you can't generalize about all Asian Americans because the fact is East Asians don't do so well at CEO positions, but South Asians like Indian Americans do extremely well. And if you look, you'll see, look at the head of Microsoft, all the tremendous number of Indian Americans who are CEOs of large public companies. And the question is, what's different, right? And that's kind of an interesting story because it's not because they look Caucasian. It's not because they don't have any accent. So it's kind of an interesting observation, but it touches on a little bit about what you say, which is there's a tendency for Indian Americans to try to help each other as a group, whereas that's not true. Chinese Americans, they help their family, whatever, but they don't necessarily help other China. And I think that's part of your advice happens to be also true and more extreme for Indian American. I mean, do you perceive that? I mean, I'm sure you have friends who are Indian American who've been successful.
I think anecdotally that's true. I think Indian Americans are very helpful to other Indian Americans if they can, right?
Yeah,
But they got there for competence. They weren't there by luck, obviously,
right.
since they're not our central casting for
Yeah, yeah,
Fortune 500 CEO. I would say the cultural differences between East Asians and South Asians, there are differences, certainly in how we're brought up and the value systems of East Asian countries versus perhaps South Asian countries. I think, and by value systems, I don't mean, moral values. I mean, in East Asian cultures, we were all brought up to be humble. That's valuable. Speak only when you're spoken to, get along. Don't be confrontational. And I think in other cultures, of which South Asians have it, but many cultures have it, which is speak up, debate, be assertive. And I think certainly East Asians who grew up in a East Asian culture and then moved here, that's harder to overcome that because it's not good or bad. It just doesn't fit
yeah, right.
what American culture is looking for in their leaders. And I think the interesting thing is, as the next generation of East Asian people grow and develop in their career, get older to that point of they should be CEO now, how many become CEO? Because if you think about, I was born in '63, and Chinese Americans weren't immigrating to the U.S. Till about then when my dad came. It was the
Yeah,
first wave, right? And then after that, right? And so I'm one of the oldest I'm not even American born, right? But in terms of growing up in the United States, and I always remember that there are fewer of us at my age than 5 years younger, and
Yeah.
5 years younger, and
Yeah,
five
that's
years
true.
younger. And so I think if you grew up in the United States, then you know the American culture. You probably are more like an American than maybe an Asian. Although the home culture does have an influence, right? But I think as a leader in an American corporation, they want someone who is not in the background by definition. You're a leader. They want someone who can speak up, someone who can stand up for themselves. Because if you think about it, why would I follow someone who can't stand up for themselves? Right?
Yeah,
Why
no,
would
that's
I do
true.
that?
They're
Right?
not going to stand up at the company, right?
Right. And so people are looking for that, those kinds of behavioral traits, which only come if you grew up in a culture that rewarded that. And even though I grew up certainly in an Asian family where, to your point, Peter, that wasn't that rewarded, that was only during the time at home. The other 16 hours a day, I'm not at home. And, once you go to college, you're really out there where you learn about all the other attributes. And team sports was one of them, right? Where you're learning the attributes of American culture. And many CEOs play sports. And I think even if you look at Caucasian Americans and who the CEOs are, you took a measure, how many play team sports, how many didn't. I don't know. I have no data. I suspect a lot of them play team sports. As they learn about leading teams and how to be assertive and how to be part of a team, so you're a follower and leader at the same time.
No, no, absolutely. It's interesting. You're the first person who made that comment about different generations in terms of immigration. It's a very interesting point. And now that I think about it, because particularly Chinese American, there was the Exclusion Act,
Right.
and most people don't realize that now. But if you go back and say the Exclusion Act was a horrible, horrible
Yeah.
law. You couldn't vote, couldn't immigrate, and it shut down a lot of immigration into the United States. And so actually that is probably a factor, right? Because and it was Chinese American. It didn't affect necessarily all Asians. But I think you're right. There's a factor. There was a certain generation of people where it was stalled because there just weren't that many people immigrating, right? That's an interesting point, right?
Yeah. And so I think the data will tell us if I'm right or not. But in the next 20 years, many of the people who are 20 years younger than me will be given opportunities to ascend to leadership positions. And I think my only advice to them is, you know, uh, you're going to have to take it. Okay, you can't just sit back and hope someone from on high finally recognizes you're the person. You have to reach out. You have to lean in. You have to, and if you're denied, which can happen, there's three candidates and you didn't get it. You have to be willing to be flexible and move right
Yeah.
to other opportunities. And I think maybe some people are conservative and they don't want to do that. But I think I had to move right to take certain opportunities, and those are sacrifices. I tell people that even today, no matter what race.
Oh yeah, they only transfer you to Paris and Rome and so forth,
Right. Yeah.
right?
No, we're going to move you
You
to
mean
Timbuktu,
you
and
mean like Rome, New York, right? Or
yeah,
something
exactly.
like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
I know we have a Q&A session at the end, but someone did type in a question exactly related to something you said. And Mr. or Ms. Anonymous Attendee asked the following question. How can you tell early on, ideally before you join the company, which is a good point, whether it's very political or not, or anything culture related?
Yeah, well, I think you can try to do some things in the interview process, but I don't think you're going to find out from there. I think the other thing is to ask people who work there
Yeah.
if you have a network. Um, but truly, you won't know. And I would also say this, even if the culture in the company is political on average, it's not in every department, right? So you might be in a company that's highly political, but your chain of command might be quite supportive. And so I wouldn't preclude a company because it might have this reputation of being political. because there could be pockets where it's good. And then, join, and then you'll find out, and give it a shot. Try to find the pockets that aren't as political. And then at some point, like I did, at some point I had to say, no, it's time to move on. It's
Yeah.
just too much.
Yeah.
Yeah, the politics just causes me stress personally.
Yeah.
So I think it's hard to tell that, and you can ask people who've been there. I mean, Glassdoor is another way, but I mean, Glassdoor usually is where everybody who's not happy is writing something, so you don't really get a unbiased opinion there. But I think someone who's worked there that you trust, that's a great way to find out.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, you have a very good point, and this is a point I like to make for people who I give advice to. Two things. One is you'd be amazed at how many people will be willing to talk to you if you just ask. It's amazing. So if you're thinking about a company, go to your alumni directory.
Hmm.
Almost every school has alumni directory. You can search based on school, where they're working, and so forth. And you might find someone who's working at that company or something. And it's amazing how generous people are. If you call them up, they don't know you, you say, "Hey, you're a graduate of, Iowa State. I'm at Iowa State, or I was at Iowa State. Would you mind spending 10 minutes with me? I'm thinking about your company." So it's amazing how generous people will be to give advice.
Yeah.
People, if you reach out to, if they say no, they say no, but you had nothing to lose. I think the other thing which we haven't talked about is do a really good job of self-assessment. If you don't know yourself, I mean, basically part of what you're saying, John, is you figured yourself out. You figured out what you're good at, what you didn't like,
Right.
whatever it is. But if you didn't know that, or if you had a distorted understanding, like you thought you were really good at politics, but you were,
Hmm.
you know, you end up making bad career decisions, right?
Yeah.
So one comment I'd make to those people in the audience is before you do any homework, whatever, do a good job of self-assessment, and then go find a friend who's willing to be bluntly honest with you and tell you that in fact you have more weaknesses than kryptonite or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Because otherwise you're going to make decisions based on the wrong information, right?
Yeah. That's true.
Yeah, that's right. Now, my last question for you is, which I can't avoid asking, is do you think the current environment with the conflict between the US and China, which has created enormous problems, right, for Asians, Asian American hate activity, all these things that are going on and so forth. And, you know, do you think that in some way is going to affect how quickly or whether people can rise to the top if they're Asian American?
Yeah, I personally don't think so. At least given the the politics that we're going through today, I think most people can recognize the difference between governments not liking each other and people not liking each other. Although governments influence the people, I get that. But a lot of people who have worked in corporations, and worked in companies who are global, have traveled the world. They have colleagues in China, right? And we have 1,500 employees in China. And I thank them every day. I say, you're part of MKS, you're going to be included, right? And we try to separate the politics from people are people. And I think it is harder. You have to be aware of it for sure. But I think when you get into a company, if that is an issue in the company, then you run away from that company, right? If the CEO of that company says we're not hiring any Chinese because of I just don't like China, well, you probably want to leave that kind of a
Yeah.
company. But I think that there are many groups in the United States through history because of the immigration history who have been hated, and ostracized throughout the history of the United States. And the example is like the Irish and the Italians. Just 100 years ago, they were in the bottom of the barrel, and they're not now. They've assimilated.
And that
They've
Germans before that, right?
Germans before that,
Right, yeah.
obviously. And so I think Asian Americans. I've seen the progress in my lifetime. In the United States, it just gets better for Asian Americans in the United States. The alternative is to go to a different country where yeah you're not the minority, but the government's a little maybe a little tougher. to live with,
That's
right?
right.
Right. And so I still think the United States does offer the most welcoming. It's not perfect, but it is still the most welcoming country in the world where, you know, by your own merits, you can actually succeed, right?
There are a lot of countries that you don't want to.
Yeah, you don't want to be in, right?
Yeah. Now we have a bunch of questions,
Okay.
and let me walk through some of them. Uh, One person said, "Could you please share a bit more about how you realized that it was the right time to take on a CEO role and what prepared you for that responsibility?"
Yeah. Well, I think I would say this. In the early part of my career, I thought being a CEO was my aspiration, and was striving towards that. And if you're pretty successful, you get promoted, and everything's all up and to the right until you hit a bump in the road. And then, in that bump in the road, where career-wise, it was a pretty big bump. I got fired. So I said it. We got fired. I got fired. It was, and my wife said, "No, no, you only got fired for a day because you went to the other group the next day." I said, "Well, no, the boss sat me down and said, 'John, we're going a different way.' I mean, that's kind of getting fired, right?"
Yeah,
Um, but when you get to that stage and you realize you go home and your kids still think you're a genius, your wife still loves you. Uh, I realized that wanting to be a CEO so badly was actually compromising my ability to be a good spouse and a good parent. And if I never had that wake up call, I probably would have gone on, maybe become CEO, but probably wouldn't have a family. And so it was at that point where I said, becoming a CEO is being nice to have. I'd take it, but it's not going to define me, right?
yeah, yeah,
And of course, after that, when you don't want it so badly, you're working hard, you should be in position to do it. Because when people say, the person is not trying to be, they're not doing everything just to become the CEO. They're doing everything because they're doing the right thing
yeah,
for their job. And I think that isn't about integrity. That's about doing your job where you have it. Um, Also saying, look, raise my hand if that option comes as CEO, I'm in, right?
yeah, yeah,
But I think now I can look back and say I think that was a good wake up call to want to be the CEO, but then to realize what's really more important is the family or whatever relationship is important to you. Because remember the day the board came out of the meeting to decide if I would be the CEO, and they shook my hand, congratulations, you're going to be next CEO, was the best day from a career standpoint, but also the worst day. Because, and then people ask, well, why would it be the worst day? Well, the CEO usually is your last job. It
ah,
ends. It ends, right? Especially a public company, it ends at 65, give or take,
yeah,
a public company. And so it's your last gig, your career ends at the end of this job, assuming you don't get fired. And when it ends, what's left is whatever you've worked on in terms of the rest of your life, right? And so I think that balance is really important to keep in mind. It also helps me keep things perspective when being a CEO, because the job is stressful. The job is 24/7, and you can never predict what happens. I became CEO in January 1st, 2020. Everybody goes back a little bit. That was one good month before COVID. So you've never been CEO yet. Congratulations. We have to shut all the factories down. I don't know if we can have people come in and make stuff. Everybody go home. And, we didn't have laptops for admins,
yeah, yeah,
right? So now we got, yeah, anyway, on and on, safety and all that. So it's one emergency after the other, it feels like. But that is normal, right? That is the job you're signing up to do. So keeping that perspective of, hey, in the end, what's really important, I got to keep whole, right? Which for me is my family.
yeah. And I feel the same way. And when I started Young Partners, I left Lehman, and the head of investment bank, Lehman, said, "Can I offer you more money?" I said, "No, because I'll probably make less money for a while." And he said, "Well, why?" I said, "Because at that time my son was born, and I said if I continued the lifestyle of a senior investment banker at Lehman, I would never go to his school play. I would never, I would see half of every show that I was supposed to go to." And so I said, It's not worth it. But it turned out it became more exciting to build an investment banking firm that was successful and to work smart people, but also spend time on things that I cared about that otherwise I wouldn't be able to do, right?
Yeah.
And that's very, very, you know, that is a very, very important, part of the equation.
Yeah.
Next question. Boy, this anonymous attendee is asking lots of questions. I think it's a number of people.
Yeah.
Tell us an important lesson you learned from your failure, or I'm sorry, it's a failure parentheses, yes, failure or failures.
Yeah, I would say this. So that example I gave of being fired, of course, I thought I was unrightly fired, but okay. But I said let's look back on why. And the one thing I did learn from that, I was running for the first time a P&L, so a general manager, and I, I was very good at the product development, the technical part, leading that part of it, understanding the markets. But I didn't watch the P&L as closely as I do now. Let's put it that way. And that's one of the things I had to learn the hard way, which was, when you're asked to run the P&L, that is job one. Everything else follows from that, right? If you don't get that right, then you're not doing the job they paid you to do. And so now, certainly as a public company CEO, you have to make the numbers, if you will, every quarter. And by the way, 3 years from now, you have to make that number too, because you gave a guidance of 3 years from now, we're going to be this size and this profitable. But paying attention to the numbers was one of the hard lessons I learned. I need to do more of that and make that a bigger priority.
Yeah, and to extend what you said, I would extend and say, when you think about it, the CEO has to be comfortable with all different aspects of the business. If you rose up and you were great in sales and marketing, but if you don't know the finance side, and if you don't understand enough about the manufacturing or the R&D side, how are you going to lead people in those areas, right?
Yeah.
So part of it, I mean, you were talking about learning the numbers, but part of it is you got to force the very few successful CEOs are not generally familiar with a number of different functions, right?
Yeah, by
So
definition, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
you got to find a way. You're not necessarily going to be the leading expert on R&D or whatever, but you got to know enough to know how to help lead those people. Do you
Yeah,
agree?
I agree. The biggest transition I read somewhere was failure in transition on career was your first promotion. So a lot of people fail that one because they went from an individual contributor to managing 10 people. The next failure point was going from a functional leader, so head of engineering, head of sales, head of finance, to general manager.
Yeah,
But suddenly, to your point, you got to know all of it, and you're not an expert in any of it except one, right? By
yeah,
definition, and you're no longer the smartest person in the room because because there are other people who know the other functions better, and so you have to know enough. You have to be interested enough to learn those things, and then hire the really good people and trust. And you have to be able to trust them. I said that slightly differently. I didn't say just trust them. I said you have to know enough to ask them the questions so that you can develop the trust in them.
yeah, that's right. It's very interesting. By the way, I learned also this lesson about having to force myself to learn the things that I didn't know. And I remember when I was thinking of starting my own investment bank, I talked to 5 or 6 people who were running investment banking boutiques. And, I was really surprised with the advice from one of them. He said, you're a part of the group that missed it where, all the laptops and everything. And I said, that's true. And so you probably are just not good at technology. I said, well, I'm not trained in technology. And he said, I bet you had what they call a decorative PC. If you're managing director at Lehman and my age group, if you had we all had PCs
Right.
in our offices, but they were called decorative PCs. These people say they lights blink and so forth, but they don't do anything, right? And he says, I know this is odd advice, but to run an investment bank, you really got to know technology, everything from, you know, uh, cybersecurity and everything and technology. So you've got to force yourself to really know technology. So
Yeah.
that's what I did for 6 months. And it was painful. It was really painful. But later on, I had dinner with the same guy. I said, "You're absolutely right." And I would never figured it out, or I would have figured it out eventually if you hadn't told me, you know? So again, it's part of the how do you develop the skill set you need to be a good leader, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see here. Uh, we have lots of interesting questions here. Oh, uh, one such as any insights on the board relationship. And I assume you had a relationship with the board before you became CEO, and certainly relationship with the board once you became CEO. Any insights?
Yeah, I would say this. The board, and I'm on another public company board, but I think I'm in my 60th board meeting for just MKS, not a CEO. I would say this, just really keep in mind that board members come in once a quarter on average, and see management, once a quarter for a day. That's it. And if you were not in the C-suite, but you were presenting, you're a general manager, you're presenting, they see you once a quarter for 20 minutes.
Yeah.
And they might have a social gathering where they meet, some management at dinner and whatnot. Um, so the board is, that's all they have to go on you personally, right? And so I think my team is always a little complaining about how anal I am about the board deck. I
Yeah.
said, look, if we make a mistake and it rat holes into a conversation, it's not value add. We need them to give us advice on the bigger picture and this and that. If you make a mistake and you say something wrong or differently, or you didn't have the number right, that's their impression of you. You can't get your numbers right, and you're the general manager. That's not a good look, right? And so I would always keep in mind that any interactions with boards should be viewed with that lens. Prepare, make sure you're very fair and precise and accurate, and that everything you do is an impression that they're going to have. And that impression, it's like an elevator speech, right? It's like you got 10 seconds, and you've got to make sure those 10 seconds are accurate and correct, and how you want to be, portrayed to the board. If you're the CEO running board meetings every quarter, you've got to make sure your team is prepared, because the board's going to see your team for 20 minutes each and go, what about Bob? Is he really as good as we need?
Yeah.
And now you're defending because Bob, had a bad slide, right? Or he didn't answer that question well enough because I didn't prepare him well enough, maybe, as whatever it is. So boards do have that very short interaction time, and you should always keep that in mind.
There's one question, it's a very long question, but the gist of it is, what are the pros and cons about staying at one company or, not moving much versus movement? Without the obvious pro con, if you stay with a company, you know the culture, you know the people, and
Yeah.
it's easier to maneuver around. If you move from company to company, there are pluses and minuses.
Yeah, we tend to, it depends on the industry, but in our industry, we kind of worry when someone's moved around too often. And let's say someone has a resume that's every 2 years, even when they're in middle career and whatnot. And the reason we're worried is, well, that means that in 2 years they're going to leave us because that's the pattern, right? It's history. And then we have to decide, do we want to invest in someone like that? Train them for a year and then get a year and then goodbye. And in some cases, maybe that's okay, but in many cases, we kind of look askance at. We're going to train someone they're here for 5, 10 years, a commitment, right? So I would say that's a generalization. I think certainly, some of my kids are investment banking. It's every 2 years in the beginning
Yeah.
until it's not, right? So it's different that way. But in general, if you're going from one company to another, if it's too short a period of time, uh, you have one chance to say, I made a mistake. I joined a company. I thought the culture was good and it was backstabbing, so I left. That's fine. But if it's every 2 years, it's a new company, then you wonder if they're always looking for that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, rather than, hey, are you committed to my team? Are you committed to my company? Are you committed to my mission? because that's the kind of people I want, right? And
Yeah,
that's not, when you're hiring, you want the same thing. Right?
yeah. But also, a lot of it also depends upon what you move to. You know, if you just move from marketing department to another marketing department versus if you got pulled into having a more senior role and so forth, it's just going to be viewed differently, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's fine. If you're promoted, no one will say that was a bad idea, right? You would go, right?
Yeah, that's right. Well, we try very hard to start on time and end on time and not to be discourteous to people. We had 15 questions and we managed to answer four. What I will do is I'll copy these questions on to John. One or two people said, is there a way to be connected somehow afterwards? Well, type your email address and name into the chat box. I'll leave it open for a little while and I'll at least convey it to John and let John make his own decision about whether he wants to connect or not. But I want to end by just saying, uh, John, thank you so much for taking this time. It's very thoughtful and very relevant to the topic. And I hope the attendees enjoyed this conversation.
Great. Thanks, Peter. I enjoyed it as well. Take care.